Dust swirled around Abigail's worn boots as the locomotive hissed its final breath at the Silverton depot. She had traveled 1,000 miles for a promise of marriage, only to be publicly humiliated by the man holding her letters. Stranded, heartbroken, and clutching her meager belongings, she believed her life was over. But from the shadows of the platform stepped a towering, grizzled mountain man. Leaning in, his voice a low, rough rumble, he changed her destiny forever. "My twins need a mother just like you." The air in Silverton, Colorado, tasted of sulfur, pine, and the bitter tang of shattered promises. It was the autumn of 1883, and the San Juan Mountains loomed like jagged, unyielding teeth against a bruised purple sky. Abigail Abernathy stood frozen on the wooden planks of the railway platform, the heavy worsted wool of her gray travel dress suffocating her in the unseasonable afternoon heat. She was 26 years old, a woman of abundant, heavy proportions, possessing a soft, full figure that the cruel society of Philadelphia had long deemed a tragedy. She had never hidden this fact. In every letter sent westward, she had been meticulously honest about her size, her sturdy build, and her lack of delicate refinement. Yet, as she clutched her battered leather valise, the reality of her honesty seemed to have fallen on deliberately blind eyes. A few yards away stood Charles Wainwright. He was precisely as his tintype photograph had promised, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored broadcloth suit with a neatly trimmed mustache and the self-satisfied posture of a man who owned the town's most prosperous mercantile. He held a bundle of Abigail's letters, tied in a neat blue ribbon. However, the poetic, yearning man who had penned those letters was nowhere to be found in the cold, sneering eyes that now raked over Abigail's trembling form. "This is some sort of jest," Charles announced, his voice carrying effortlessly over the hiss of the departing locomotive. He did not step closer to her. Rather, he took a half-step back, as if her sheer presence were a contagion. "You are Abigail Abernathy, the baker's daughter from Pennsylvania?" "I am, Mr. Wainwright," Abigail said, her voice remarkably steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. She adjusted her grip on her valise, her knuckles stark white. "I am precisely the woman you sent for." "The devil you are," Charles scoffed, a harsh sound that drew the attention of the loitering townsfolk. Mrs. Gable, the town gossip, paused with her parasol halfway opened, her eyes widening with predatory glee. Deputy Miller leaned against the station house wall, watching the spectacle unfold. Charles gestured sharply toward Abigail, his face flushing with a mixture of anger and profound embarrassment. "I requested a bride, madam, a woman to grace my home and stand by my side at town functions. I did not send for a spectacle. You are twice the size of a normal woman. My God, you cannot expect me to walk you down the aisle of the First Methodist Church looking like this. You'd break the floorboards." A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd of onlookers. A few muffled snickers followed. The sound was like a physical blow to Abigail's chest. The air fled her lungs, and for a terrifying moment, the jagged peaks of the mountains spun wildly in her vision. She had sacrificed everything for this ticket. After her father's death, the bakery's debts had swallowed their home, leaving her destitute. Charles's advertisement in the matrimonial news had been her lifeline. She had poured her heart out to him, sending recipes, pressed flowers, and honest descriptions of her robust frame. He had replied with sweet assurances that a strong woman was required for the frontier. "Mr. Wainwright," Abigail managed to say, lifting her chin, she would not let this arrogant man see her cry. "I was entirely forthright in my correspondence. I wrote to you of my stature. I sent my measurements for the wedding gown you insisted on having made. I assumed it was a clerical error, or an exaggeration of feminine modesty," Charles snapped, tossing the bundle of letters at her feet. They scattered in the thick mountain dust. "I am a man of standing in Silverton. I will not be made a laughingstock by parading a mountain of a woman through town as my wife. The arrangement is void." "I have nowhere to go," Abigail stated, the stark reality of her situation overriding her humiliation. "I have exactly 42 cents to my name. You promised me a home. And you promised me a wife, not a burden. Charles sneered, turning on his heel. "Take the next train back to Philadelphia, Miss Abernathy, or find work washing floors at the saloon. It is all you are fit for." With that, he tipped his bowler hat to the whispering crowd and marched away, leaving Abigail stranded in the swirling dust. The townsfolk lingered for a moment, their eyes filled with a toxic mixture of pity and revulsion, before slowly dispersing. Mrs. Gable whispered something to a companion behind her gloved hand, her eyes darting to Abigail's heavy hips and round face. Abigail stood entirely alone on the platform. The silence left in the wake of the crowd was deafening. Slowly, her stiff legs gave way, and she sank onto her large wooden trunk. She did not weep. The pain was too deep, too hollow for tears. She stared at the blue ribbon lying in the dirt, the symbol of her shattered hopes. She was 26, impoverished, humiliated, and stranded in a rugged, unforgiving territory where a woman's worth was weighed in her delicate beauty or her wealthy dowry. She closed her eyes, praying for the earth to open and swallow her whole. It was then that she heard the heavy, deliberate thud of boots on the wooden boards. The footsteps did not have the rapid, hurried cadence of a townsman. They were slow, measured, and carried the weight of the wild. Abigail opened her eyes to find a shadow eclipsing the harsh afternoon sun. Standing before her was a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite of the surrounding peaks. He was impossibly tall, his shoulders as broad as a barn door, clad in a weathered buckskin jacket fringed with leather. A thick, dark beard obscured the lower half of his face, but his eyes, a piercing, startling shade of ice blue, were fixed squarely on her. He wore a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low, and a heavy Winchester rifle was slung casually over his back. He smelled of pine resin, wood smoke, and sweat. He was a mountain man, raw and untamed, a stark contrast to the manicured, cruel merchant who had just abandoned her. The man slowly reached down with a massive scarred hand and picked up the scattered letters from the dust. He dusted them off against his leather chaps and held them out to her. Abigail hesitated, looking from the letters to his weathered face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. The man did not leave. He stood there, his ice-blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her instinctively pull her shawl tighter around her broad shoulders. She braced herself for another insult, another cruel jest about her size. Instead, the man spoke. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the wooden platform. "That fella is a fool," the man said softly. "A blind, arrogant fool." Abigail blinked, caught entirely off guard. "Excuse me?" The mountain man shifted his weight, his gaze never leaving hers. "The name is Adrian Boone. I live up at the timberline on the edge of the Black Bear Pass. I saw what happened here. I heard what he said." "Then you know I'm a disgrace," Abigail said bitterly, looking away toward the rusted tracks. "A spectacle." "I know no such thing," Adrian corrected firmly. He crouched down so that he was eye level with her, an action that required surprising grace for a man of his immense size. "I see a woman who didn't flinch when a coward yelled at her. I see a woman built to survive the winter, not snap in the wind like a dry twig." Abigail's breath hitched. No one had ever spoken of her body as a testament to strength before. It had always been a flaw to hide, a sin to apologize for. Adrian Boone removed his hat, revealing thick, unruly dark hair. His expression turned deadly serious. "I don't have much use for town manners, ma'am, so I will speak plainly. I have a cabin 10 miles up the mountain. It ain't pretty and it's isolated. But I have 2 children, twins. A boy and a girl, barely 4 years old. They are wild, they are scared, and they need a mother." Abigail stared at him, her mind struggling to process his words. You're offering me a position as a governess?" "I am offering you a marriage of convenience," Adrian stated. His voice a low whisper meant only for her. "My twins need a mother just like you, someone strong, someone warm, someone who won't run at the first sign of hardship. You need a home, a name, and protection from the likes of Charles Wainwright. I will provide a roof, food, and my absolute respect. I will never lay a hand on you in anger, and I will never ask for more than you are willing to give. But I need you to care for Toby and Clara." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs. Marry a stranger? A wild mountain man she had known for less than 5 minutes? It was madness. But as she looked into Adrian Boone's ice-blue eyes, she saw no mockery. She saw desperation, bone-deep exhaustion, and a glimmer of profound, unwavering sincerity. She looked back at the town of Silverton, where Charles Wainwright's mercantile stood gleaming in the sun, a monument to her rejection. Abigail turned her gaze back to the towering mountain man. She squared her heavy shoulders and placed her hand in his massive, rough palm. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Boone," she said. The journey up the mountain was a grueling, bone-rattling ordeal that tested the limits of Abigail's endurance. They had been married by the local magistrate within the hour, a brief, unceremonious affair in a dusty office. Adrian had paid the $2 fee, signed his name with a heavy, deliberate hand, and escorted his new bride to a sturdy wooden wagon hitched to 2 massive draft horses. The townsfolk had stared as they departed, whispers trailing the wagon like dry leaves in the wind. The merchant's reject and the mountain hermit. Abigail had kept her chin high, her hands folded neatly in her lap, refusing to give Mrs. Gable or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her shrink. Now, hours later, the town of Silverton was nothing but a memory left far below in the valley. The wagon groaned and protested as it climbed the treacherous switchbacks of the San Juan Mountains. The air grew perceptibly thinner and bitingly cold, carrying the sharp medicinal scent of blue spruce and damp earth. Adrian drove the team in silence, his massive shoulders swaying slightly with the rhythm of the wagon. He handled the leather reins with a gentle, expert touch, guiding the horses over treacherous rocks and deep ruts. He had offered her his heavy wool blanket an hour into the climb, wrapping it around her broad shoulders with a surprising gentleness before returning to his quiet vigilance. Abigail sat beside him on the wooden bench, her body aching from the relentless jolting. Yet, despite the physical discomfort, a strange sense of peace began to settle over her. For the first time in her life, she was not surrounded by people measuring her worth against the impossible standard of a corset. Up here, surrounded by ancient pines and towering granite peaks, the sheer scale of the wilderness made human judgment seem incredibly small and insignificant. "You're shivering, Abigail." Jedediah's deep voice broke the long silence. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his tongue was rough, yet not unkind. "I am perfectly fine, Mr. Boone," Abigail replied, instinctively attempting to pull her heavy form tighter together to take up less space on the bench. Adrian noticed the movement. He pulled back slightly on the reins, slowing the horses, and turned to look at her. "You don't have to do that up here." "Do what?" "Make yourself smaller," he said flatly. "The bench is wide enough for the both of us. The mountain don't care how much space you take up. Neither do I." Abigail felt a sudden, unexpected sting of tears behind her eyes. She swallowed hard, staring straight ahead at the rear of the draft horses. "I am accustomed to accommodating others. In Philadelphia, a woman of my size is taught to apologize for her presence." Adrian scoffed softly, a sound of pure disdain for city folk. "In the mountains, size means survival. A skinny, frail thing would freeze to death before December or blow away in the first gale. Charles Wainwright is a merchant who trades in lace and teacups. He looks for a woman the same way he looks for a porcelain doll to put in his front window. I am a man who needs a partner to hold the walls of my cabin together when the blizzards hit." "I didn't just ask you because you were stranded." "Abigail." She turned her head to look at him, her heart skipping a beat. "You didn't?" "No," Adrian said, returning his eyes to the steep winding trail. "I've seen a dozen women come off that train over the years. Most of them look terrified, fragile. When that fool started hollering at you today, you didn't cry, you didn't faint. You stood there, solid as an oak, and looked him in the eye. That's what my children need. An oak tree." Abigail fell silent, turning his words over in her mind. An oak tree. It wasn't a romantic compliment, not the poetic flattery Charles had written in his letters, but there was a rugged, profound honesty in it that anchored her soul. She wasn't beautiful, she wasn't delicate, but to this man she was strong, she was necessary. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the forest floor, the terrain leveled out onto a high alpine plateau. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and twisted by years of harsh winds. "We're close," Adrian announced. Abigail leaned forward, her apprehension returning full force. She was a mother now. She had helped raise her younger cousins in Philadelphia, but taking on twin 4-year-olds who lived in absolute isolation was a different matter entirely. "You said they are wild," Abigail ventured, breaking the quiet. "Have they not had a woman's touch in a long time?" Jedediah's jaw tightened. A shadow passed over his ice-blue eyes, one darker than the approaching twilight. Their mother, Sarah. She couldn't take the mountain. The silence broke her mind. One night, 2 years ago, she just walked out the door and never came back. We found her tracks leading down toward the mining camps, then nothing. She abandoned them. Abigail gasped softly. "I am so sorry, Jedediah." "Don't be," he said coldly, his voice hardening. "She made her choice, but the twins, they remember enough to know they were left behind. Toby doesn't speak much. Clara bites if you try to hold her. I can track an elk for 3 days through a blizzard, Abigail, but when my daughter screams in the night, I don't know what to do. My hands are too rough for it." He looked down at his massive, scarred hands holding the reins, and in that brief moment, Abigail saw the raw, bleeding vulnerability beneath his fearsome exterior. This giant of a man was utterly terrified of failing his children. "My hands are soft," Abigail said quietly, unbuttoning her gloves and laying her plump, bare hands on her lap. "And they are wide enough to hold them both. We will figure it out together." Adrian looked at her hands, then up to her face. A slow, tentative gratitude softened the harsh lines around his mouth. He clicked his tongue, urging the horses forward through a thick copse of towering pines. As they cleared the trees, Abigail saw her new home. The cabin was a testament to sheer willpower. Built from massive hand-hewn pine logs and chinked with hardened mud, it sat on a natural stone shelf overlooking a vast, breathtaking valley. A stone chimney rose sturdily against the fading light, but no smoke plumed from its top. The surrounding yard was rugged, littered with chopped firewood, a rusted iron pump, and a sturdy corral holding a single milk cow. It was strong, but it was desperately desolate. It lacked any semblance of domestic warmth, no flowers by the heavy oak door, no curtains in the small glass windows. It was a fortress of survival, not a home. Adrian brought the horses to a halt and jumped down, coming around to assist Abigail. She hesitated, looking at the steep drop from the wagon, but his large hands gripped her waist effortlessly, lifting her heavy frame and setting her down on the dirt as if she weighed no more than a sack of flour. A flush rose to her cheeks. No man had ever managed to lift her so easily. "Wait here," Adrian said, pulling his rifle from the wagon. He approached the cabin with cautious, deliberate steps. He pushed the heavy door open, calling out into the gloom. "Toby, Clara, I'm home." Silence answered him. Abigail followed him inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The cabin was a single massive room with a loft above. The smell of cold ash, cured meat, and damp wool hung heavy in the air. The floor was rough-hewn planking, unswept and cluttered with boots, traps, and tools. In the center sat a massive wooden table flanked by benches. It was a man's world, stark and purely functional. "They hide when they hear the wagon," Adrian muttered, lighting a kerosene lantern on the table. The warm yellow light pushed back the shadows. He looked up toward the loft ladder. "Come on down. I brought someone to meet you." A tiny scuffling sound came from above, like mice in the rafters. Then, 2 small faces peered over the edge of the loft. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. They were beautiful, but they looked like wild, feral woodland creatures. Their dark hair was matted and tangled in thick knots, their faces smudged with dirt and soot. They wore oversized, hand-stitched flannel shirts that hung off their frail, tiny frames. 4-year-old Toby had his father's ice-blue eyes wide and terrified. Little Clara gripped her brother's hand, her dark eyes darting toward Abigail with intense suspicion. "Come down," Adrian ordered, his voice echoing loudly in the cabin. The children flinched, shrinking back from the edge. "Please, Jedediah," Abigail intervened softly, placing a gentle hand on his massive forearm. "Do not shout. They are frightened." Adrian looked at where her hand rested on his arm, then stepped back, yielding the floor to her. Abigail walked to the base of the ladder. She did not ask them to come down. Instead, she slowly lowered her large, heavy body until she was sitting cross-legged on the floorboards. She ignored the dust that clung to her expensive gray travel dress. She reached into the pocket of her skirt and retrieved a small linen handkerchief. Unfolding it carefully, she revealed 3 pieces of crystalline rock sugar she had saved from her train journey from Philadelphia. She placed the sugar on the bottom rung of the ladder. "My name is Abigail," she said, pitching her voice low, using the same soothing musical tone she used to calm the stray dogs back in the city alleys. "I came a very long way on a big, noisy train. It was terribly loud and frightening. I'm quite hungry, but I cannot possibly eat 3 pieces of sugar all by myself." She didn't look up at them. She kept her eyes on the sugar, waiting. For a long minute, the only sound in the cabin was the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Then, the creak of the ladder. Slowly, inch by inch, a small pair of bare feet descended, followed by another. Abigail remained perfectly still as Toby and Clara reached the floor. They stood a few feet away, trembling slightly, their eyes locked on the sparkling sugar. Clara let out a tiny whimper, hiding behind her brother. "You may have it," Abigail whispered, offering a warm, soft smile. Her round, plump face, so often the subject of cruel jokes, now served as a beacon of maternal safety. There were no sharp angles on her, nothing threatening. Toby took a tentative step forward, snatched 2 pieces of the sugar, and immediately handed one to his sister. They retreated back to the shadows, gnawing on the hard candy with desperate eagerness. Abigail looked over her shoulder at Jedediah. The giant mountain man was leaning against the heavy wooden table, staring at her with an expression of sheer awe. In 2 years, he had never been able to coax them out of the loft without an hour of pleading or commanding. It had taken Abigail less than 5 minutes. "Well," Abigail said, placing her hands on her sturdy knees and pushing herself up from the floor with a soft grunt of effort. She dusted her skirt and looked around the messy cabin, rolling up her sleeves to reveal her thick, capable forearms. "The first order of business is a fire, and then a hot meal. What provisions do we have, Mr. Boone?" "Salt pork, potatoes, flour, and some dried apples," Adrian answered, snapping out of his daze. "I'll get the fire going." For the next 2 hours, the cabin transformed. As Adrian chopped wood and stoked a roaring fire in the hearth, Abigail moved around the small kitchen area with surprising grace for a woman of her size. She scrubbed the iron skillet, peeled potatoes, and whipped together a thick, savory stew with dumplings. The smell of frying pork and boiling dough filled the cabin, wrapping around the cold wooden walls like a warm embrace. The twins crept closer, lured out of the shadows by the intoxicating aroma. By the time Abigail set 3 bowls on the table, Toby and Clara were hovering near her skirts. As they sat down to eat, the atmosphere was thick with a strange, unspoken tension. It wasn't hostile. It was the fragile tension of a new beginning. Adrianot with silent, mechanical efficiency, though Abigail noticed he closed his eyes in brief, silent appreciation at his first bite of the soft dumplings. The twins ate ravenously, making a mess, which Abigail gently wiped away with a damp cloth, ignoring Clara's initial flinch. After dinner, as Abigail was scrubbing the bowls in a tin basin of hot water, a loud, sharp pounding echoed through the cabin. Someone was banging furiously on the heavy oak door. Jedediah's head snapped up. In an instant, the gentle husband vanished, replaced by the dangerous mountain man. He moved with terrifying speed, snatching his Winchester rifle from the table. "Get behind the hearth," he ordered Abigail, his voice a lethal whisper. He signaled to the twins, who immediately scrambled under the large bed in the corner, a maneuver they had clearly practiced. Abigail wiped her wet, soapy hands on her apron, her heart racing as she backed toward the stone fireplace. Who would ride 10 miles up a treacherous mountain trail in the pitch black of night? Adrian approached the door, cocking the lever of the rifle with a loud, ominous clack. "Who is it?" Adrian barked. "Open the damn door, Boone!" a voice shouted from the other side, muffled by the thick wood and the howling mountain wind. It was a voice Abigail recognized instantly. It was Charles Wainwright. The heavy oak door swung inward, groaning on its iron hinges as the biting wind of the high San Juans roared into the cabin. Adrian stood squarely in the frame, his massive form entirely blocking the entrance. The Winchester rifle in his hands was leveled steadily at the chest of the man shivering on the porch. It was Charles Wainwright. He was flanked by Deputy Miller and a third man, a stranger in a heavy bowler hat holding a leather satchel. Charles's face, usually so composed and smug, was pinched with cold, his expensive broadcloth coat entirely unsuited for the brutal drop in temperature at the timberline. "You have exactly 5 seconds to state your business before I let the mountain have you, Wainwright." Jedediah's voice was lower than the howling wind, a deadly, vibrating threat. "Put the gun down, Boone," Charles chattered, his breath puffing in frantic white clouds. "I'm here on official business under the jurisdiction of San Juan County. We have a writ." Abigail stepped out from behind the stone hearth. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she forced her broad shoulders back, lifting her chin. "Have you come to humiliate me further, Mr. Wainwright? Because I assure you, your cruelty holds no power here." Charles sneered, his eyes darting toward her before returning to Jedediah. "Don't flatter yourself, Abigail. You are merely a fortuitous byproduct of my trip. I couldn't care less who this hermit married. I am here for the land." Jedediah's finger tightened infinitesimally on the trigger. "This land is mine. I homesteaded it 6 years ago." "And you failed to pay the updated territorial property taxes assessed last month by the Silverton Town Council," the man with the satchel spoke up, stepping forward. "I am Arthur Vance. Apologies. Arthur Pendleton, agent for the Gold King Mining Corporation. Mr. Wainwright here recently purchased the tax lien on this parcel. We have reason to believe the Sunnyside vein extends directly beneath this ridge." Abigail's mind raced. Growing up in Philadelphia, she had not just baked bread. She had managed her late father's complex ledgers, navigated aggressive creditors, and studied business law to keep the bakery afloat as long as she could. She knew the mechanics of debt and foreclosure intimately. "Show me the writ," Abigail demanded, her voice cutting through the wind with startling authority. Charles laughed, a bitter barking sound. "You are a baker's daughter. What do you know of Colorado mining law?" "I know a liar when he stands on my porch," Abigail countered, taking heavy, deliberate steps toward the door. She did not cower behind her husband. She stood beside him, her physical presence imposing. "Hand over the writ, Mr. Pendleton, or are you afraid a baker's daughter might find your arithmetic lacking?" Pendleton hesitated, glancing at the deputy, then pulled a folded parchment from his satchel and handed it to her. Abigail moved toward the kerosene lantern on the table, her eyes scanning the dense, ink-heavy text. The cabin was dead silent, save for the crackling fire and the muffled whimpers of the twins hiding under the bed. As her eyes swept over the dates, the seals and the signatures, a cold realization bloomed into fiery anger. "This writ is dated October 4th, 1883, Abigail said smoothly, turning to face the 3 men. "That was last week. Your point?" Charles snapped. "My point, Mr. Wainwright, is that this document bears the seal of the Colorado Territory." Abigail pointed a plump, steady finger at the bottom corner of the page. "Colorado achieved statehood in 1876. A federal judge, such as Judge Moses Hallett in Denver, would never issue a tax lien using an obsolete territorial seal. Furthermore, San Juan County tax assessments are legally required to be posted in the town square for 90 days before a lien can be auctioned. I was in your town square today. There was no such posting." Charles's face drained of color. The deputy shifted uncomfortably, suddenly looking anywhere but at Jedediah's rifle. "She's bluffing," Charles hissed to Pendleton. "I am perfectly willing to take this document down to the federal marshal in Durango to verify its authenticity." Abigail challenged, taking a step toward Charles. She drew herself up to her full height. Beside the giant mountain man, she looked like an immovable force of nature. But if I do, the marshal will want to know why the proprietor of Silverton's largest mercantile is forging legal documents to steal land from a man with 2 children. I imagine the penalty for land fraud in a mining district is quite severe, perhaps 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Pendleton snatched the paper back from Abigail's hand, his eyes wide with panic. Wainwright assured me this was a legal transfer. I want no part of this. He turned and began trudging back toward their horses. Get back here, Charles shouted, his voice cracking. Adrian stepped forward, the barrel of his Winchester pressing gently but firmly against Charles's chest. My wife gave you a lesson in the law. Now I'm giving you a lesson in survival. If you or your men ever step foot on Black Bear Pass again, they won't find enough of you to bury. Get off my mountain. Charles Wainwright looked at Abigail, his eyes burning with a hateful, impotent fury. He had thought her weak, a desperate, obese woman he could easily discard. Instead, she had just dismantled his grand scheme with a single glance at a piece of paper. Uttering a foul curse, Charles turned and scrambled into the darkness after the deputy. Adrian slammed the door shut, dropping the iron bar into place. He leaned against the heavy wood, exhaling a long, ragged breath. He turned to look at Abigail. The fierce, commanding woman who had just stared down 3 men was now trembling slightly, the adrenaline leaving her system. Adrian slowly lowered his rifle. He walked over to her, his massive hands reaching out to gently grasp her upper arms. His touch was warm, grounding. I have faced down grizzly bears, Abigail, Adrian whispered, his ice-blue eyes filled with profound wonder. But I have never seen anything quite as fierce as what you just did. Abigail's breath hitched. I despise bullies, Mr. Boone. Jedediah, he corrected softly. Call me Jedediah. From under the bed, 2 small heads peeked out. Toby scrambled out first, running across the room. He didn't run to his father. He ran straight to Abigail, wrapping his small arms around her heavy, sturdy legs, burying his face in her skirts. Abigail looked down, tears finally spilling over her lashes. She placed a gentle, broad hand on the boy's head. She was home. Winter in the San Juan Mountains did not arrive gently. It attacked. By mid-November, the world outside this cabin was swallowed by blinding white. The snowdrifts piled high against the log walls, burying the windows and trapping them in a world of perpetual twilight. For Abigail, the isolation was a trial by fire, but it was also a profound liberation. There were no judgmental eyes here, no corset strings to pull until she bruised, no whispered insults in the bakery line. There was only survival, the crackle of the hearth, and the children. Over the next 6 weeks, Abigail transformed the grim fortress into a home. Using her father's heavy canvas flour sacks and her own sewing kit, she fashioned thick, warm curtains to block the drafts. She spent hours baking hearty breads, rendering bear fat for soap, and mending clothes. Her large, capable hands were never idle. Her size, long considered her greatest flaw, became her greatest asset. When the cabin required water, she could carry 2 massive iron buckets from the frozen pump without breaking a sweat. When the fire dwindled, she could haul heavy split logs that would have broken a smaller woman's back. She radiated heat, and in the freezing nights, she became the warm center of the family. Toby had attached himself to her completely. The silent boy now babbled happily as he helped her knead dough. Clara, however, remained distant. The little girl watched Abigail with dark, fearful eyes, always keeping the heavy wooden table between them. She had been abandoned by a slender, beautiful mother. She did not know what to make of this vast, soft woman. The true test arrived in the first week of December, during what the locals would later call the Great White Hurricane of '83. Adrian had left at dawn to check his trap lines in the lower valley, promising to return by noon. By 10 o'clock, the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The wind howled with the sound of a dying animal, and the temperature plummeted so rapidly that the moisture on the inside of the cabin windows instantly froze into thick ice. By 3 in the afternoon, Adrian had not returned. Abigail paced the floorboards, trying to keep her anxiety hidden from the twins. The wind was hitting the cabin with the force of a freight train, shaking the heavy logs. Suddenly, a massive crack echoed from outside, followed by the frantic, terrified bellow of their milk cow, Bessie. Abigail rushed to the frosted window, scratching away the ice. Through the blinding swirl of snow, she saw that the heavy wooden doors of the barn had been torn open by the gale. The snow was blowing directly into the stalls. If the cow froze, they would lose their primary source of fat and milk for the children. She looked at the twins. Clara was huddled in the corner, her hands over her ears. "Stay by the fire," Abigail commanded gently, grabbing Jedediah's heavy buffalo hide coat. It swallowed her frame, but she welcomed the weight. She tied a thick rope around her waist, securing the other end to the heavy iron ring beside the front door. She pushed the door open, and the storm hit her like a physical blow. The wind screamed, tearing at her clothes, driving needles of ice into her cheeks. A smaller woman would have been lifted off her feet and blown off the ridge, but Abigail planted her heavy leather-booted feet deep into the snow. She used her substantial weight to anchor herself against the gale, leaning forward and dragging herself through the thigh-deep drifts toward the barn. The 40 yards felt like 40 miles. By the time she reached the barn, her lungs were burning and her fingers were numb. Bessie was thrashing in her stall, half buried in a snowdrift that had blown through the open doors. One of the massive doors was hanging by a single iron hinge, swinging violently in the wind. Abigail knew she couldn't fix the hinge, but she could barricade it. She found a heavy oak beam used for propping up the wagon. Maneuvering it into the driving snow, she threw her entire body weight against the swinging door. The wind fought back fiercely, crushing the heavy wood against her shoulder, bruising her flesh. She roared against the storm, a sound born of years of pent-up frustration and newfound strength. She drove her heavy legs into the frozen earth, pushing with everything she had. Slowly, agonizingly, the door closed. She jammed the oak beam into place, sealing the barn. Exhausted, gasping for air, she stumbled back to the cabin, following her lifeline rope. When she finally pulled herself inside and barred the door, she collapsed onto the floorboards, covered in snow, shivering violently. "Abby!" Toby cried, running to her. But it was Clara who surprised her. The little girl crept out from her corner, dragging the heavy wool quilt from the bed. With trembling hands, Clara draped the quilt over Abigail's broad shoulders, her dark eyes wide with awe. "You stayed," Clara whispered, her voice rusty from disuse. "Mama left when the snow came, but you stayed." Abigail's heart broke open. She pulled the little girl into her lap, wrapping her thick, soft arms around her. Clara didn't flinch. She buried her cold face into Abigail's warm neck, finally surrendering to the mother she so desperately needed. Hours later, the door rattled. Adrian burst in, covered in ice, his face pale with terror. He had been trapped under a fallen tree in the valley and had fought his way up the mountain in the dark, terrified he would find his family frozen. Instead, he found the cabin warm, smelling of baked bread. In a massive rocking chair by the hearth sat Abigail. She was fast asleep, her broad chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. Curled up tightly on her lap, safe and warm against her soft body, were Toby and Clara. Adrian fell to his knees in the center of the room, peeling off his frozen gloves, overcome by a wave of emotion so powerful it brought tears to his fierce eyes. He had married her for convenience, but looking at her now, he realized he was looking at the very soul of his home. The storm raged for 3 days, but inside the timberline cabin, a new, profound peace had settled. The invisible wall that had separated Abigail and Adrian was gone, washed away by the sheer force of their mutual survival. On the 4th night, the wind finally died down, leaving an eerie, crystalline silence over the mountain. The children were fast asleep in the loft, wrapped in thick quilts, their bellies full of potato stew. Abigail sat at the heavy wooden table in her nightgown, rubbing a crude salve of beeswax and pine resin into the deep purple bruises on her shoulder where the barn door had battered her. She winced, trying to reach a particularly tender spot near her collarbone. A large, rough hand gently took the tin of salve from her fingers. Adrian pulled up a wooden stool behind her. He didn't ask for permission. He simply dipped his fingers into the ointment and began to massage it into her bruised skin. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to his immense rugged strength. "You saved our livelihood, Abigail," Adrian said softly, his deep voice vibrating in the quiet cabin. "If we had lost Bessie, the children would have suffered immensely this winter." "I only did what was necessary," Abigail murmured, closing her eyes as the warmth of his hands eased the aching in her muscles. "You do more than what's necessary," Adrian corrected. He moved his hands down her arms, his thumbs tracing the thick, sturdy lines of her muscles. "You bring life into this place. You brought my daughter back to me." Abigail's breath hitched. She opened her eyes, looking at his reflection in the dark, frosted window pane. "I was so terrified, Jedediah. When you didn't come back, I thought the mountain had taken you. I thought I was going to be left alone again." Adrian stopped his movements. He stood up, gently taking her hand and urging her to stand. She turned to face him. Without her heavy skirts and aprons, clad only in her thick flannel nightgown, she felt intensely vulnerable. She instinctively crossed her arms over her soft, round stomach, an old habit of trying to hide her size. Adrian gently reached out and pulled her arms apart. "Do not hide from me," he whispered, his ice-blue eyes burning with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I have looked at you, Abigail, really looked at you. From the moment you stood on that platform in Silverton, I saw a woman of substance, a woman built by God to weather the storms." "Charles called me a spectacle," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "A mountain." "He was half right," Adrian said, stepping closer, his massive chest brushing against hers. "You are a mountain, beautiful, formidable, and giving life to everything that clings to you. You are the most magnificent creature I have ever laid eyes on." He reached up, his rough fingers tangling in her loose, dark hair. He tilted her face upward. When his lips met hers, it was not the hesitant peck of a marriage of convenience. It was a kiss of profound, consuming passion. It was the kiss of a starving man who had finally found a feast. Abigail gasped, leaning into him. She wrapped her thick arms around his broad, muscular back, pulling him flush against her heavy curves. For the first time in her 26 years, her body was not a burden to be accommodated. It was a treasure to be held. Adrian worshipped her softness, his hands mapping the wide, lush landscape of her hips and waist with reverent awe. That night, the small, solitary cot Adrian had slept on for weeks remained empty. In the large bed in the corner, surrounded by the howling cold of the San Juans, they found a burning, desperate warmth in each other. Their marriage was no longer a contract. It was sealed in the quiet, sacred dark of the cabin. Months passed. The brutal winter slowly lost its grip, giving way to the brilliant, piercing sunlight of a high-altitude spring. The snowpack began to melt, sending roaring torrents of ice water down the Black Bear Pass. Patches of brown earth and vibrant green alpine grass began to peek through the white. Abigail had never been happier. She was a mother. She was deeply loved by a man who looked at her as if she hung the moon, and she had a home she had built with her own 2 hands. But the mountain had a long memory, and the melting snow was preparing to give up its dead. One crisp morning in late May, Adrian was out near the eastern property line, digging a new trench to divert the snowmelt away from the barn. The earth was soft and muddy. As his shovel bit deep into the soil near a cluster of ancient spruce trees, it struck something hard with a dull metallic clink. Thinking it was a buried mining tool left by old prospectors, Adrian dug around it, pulling it free from the dark mud. He froze, his blood running colder than the ice water pooling at his boots. It was a small, ornate silver locket. He knew it instantly. He had bought it for his first wife, Sarah, in Denver 5 years ago. But it wasn't the locket that made his hands shake. Tangled violently in the delicate chain of the locket was a heavy gold pocket watch chain, a chain bearing the distinct custom-engraved crest of the Wainwright family. Adrian scrubbed the mud from the locket, popping the clasp open. Inside was a tiny tintype of Toby and Clara as infants. Behind the picture, folded into a tiny square, was a scrap of ledger paper. Adrian unfolded it with trembling, mud-stained fingers. The ink was faded, but legible. It was a frantic note, written in Sarah's frantic scrawl. He knows about the vein. Charles Wainwright is coming for the land. He threatened the twins. I am going to the marshal in Silverton. If I do not make it, know that I did not leave you. The note ended abruptly in a smear of dark, dried blood. Adrian stared at the piece of paper, the terrifying truth washing over him. Sarah hadn't abandoned them. She had discovered Wainwright's plot to steal the Sunnyside vein extension years ago. She had tried to save her family, and Wainwright had intercepted her on the mountain. He had murdered her and buried her on her own land. And now, Wainwright knew Abigail had seen through his forged tax lien. He knew Abigail was smart enough to piece together the land fraud. A sudden, sharp crack of a rifle echoed from the valley below, shattering the morning silence. It wasn't a hunter. It was the heavy caliber of a buffalo rifle, firing from the ridge overlooking the cabin. Adrian dropped the shovel, his heart leaping into his throat. He turned toward the cabin. "Abigail!" he roared, sprinting through the mud as a second shot splintered the wood of the front door. Charles Wainwright had not given up. He had returned to bury the rest of his secrets. The second shot echoed off the granite peaks, a violent crack that sent a flock of ravens scattering into the pale morning sky. Adrian threw himself into the freezing mud just as a third bullet tore through the very spot he had been standing, burying itself deep into the trunk of a spruce tree. He didn't panic. Panic was a luxury a mountain man could not afford. Moving with the silent, lethal grace of a hunting cat, Adrian scrambled on his belly toward the broad stump where he had rested his Winchester rifle. He snatched the cold steel weapon, checking the lever. He had 14 rounds. Up on the ridge, peering through the sparse timber, he spotted the plumes of white gun smoke. There were 3 of them. Charles Wainwright had not come alone. He had brought hired muscle, desperate men from the lower mining camps willing to do dirty work for Silverton's wealthiest merchant. "Burn them out!" Charles's voice drifted down the slope, thin and reedy but laced with hysterical malice. "Leave no witnesses. The deed dies with them today." Inside the cabin, the sound of splintering wood had sent a jolt of pure terror through Abigail's heart. She didn't freeze. The maternal instinct that had taken root in her over the brutal winter flared into a blazing, protective inferno. "Toby! Clara!" Abigail roared, dropping her sewing basket. The twins scrambled down from the loft, their faces pale with fright. Abigail grabbed them both, half carrying, half dragging them toward the heavy braided rug in the center of the room. She kicked the rug aside, revealing the iron ring of the root cellar trap door. Pulling it open with a single, powerful heave of her broad shoulders, she ushered the children into the dark, earthen-smelling hole. "Do not make a sound. Do not come out until your father or I open this door. Do you understand?" she commanded, her voice steady and fierce. Toby nodded, pulling his sister into his arms. Abigail lowered the heavy door, sealing them in safety. A bullet shattered the front window, raining jagged glass across the wooden floorboards. Abigail dropped to her hands and knees. She crawled toward the massive stone hearth. Above the mantel rested Jedediah's backup weapon, a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun, a devastating close-quarters firearm meant for stopping charging grizzly bears. She reached up, her thick muscular arms straining, and pulled the heavy weapon down. She broke the barrel open, ensuring 2 brass-cased shells were loaded, and snapped it shut with a terrifying, definitive clack. Outside, the battle had begun in earnest. Adrian moved like a ghost through the timber. He flanked the men on the ridge, his ice-blue eyes narrowed into lethal slits. The man who had taken everything from his children, the man who had murdered Sarah and buried her in the cold mud, was 50 yards away. Adrian raised his Winchester. He didn't aim for Charles, not yet. He aimed for the burly thug lighting a kerosene-soaked rag shoved into the neck of a whiskey bottle. The Winchester cracked. The thug collapsed, the unlit bottle shattering on the rocks. "He's in the trees," the second hired gun shouted, swinging his rifle wildly toward the tree line. Adrian levered another round, firing twice in rapid succession. The second man screamed, dropping his weapon and clutching his leg. tumbling down the steep rocky incline into the freezing snowmelt of the creek. Charles Wainwright was suddenly alone. The arrogant merchant, entirely out of his element in the brutal reality of a gunfight, panicked. Instead of retreating up the mountain, he scrambled frantically down the slope, sliding through the mud, making a desperate run for the rear of the cabin where he assumed Abigail was cowering in terror. Adrian broke from the trees, sprinting after him, his boots tearing up the earth. "Abigail!" he bellowed, his voice echoing over the valley. Inside the cabin, Abigail heard the heavy, frantic boots stomping onto the back porch. She positioned herself behind the heavy oak table, the massive 10-gauge shotgun resting steadily against her sturdy hip. She didn't shake. She planted her heavy leather boots into the floorboards, making herself an immovable object. The back door did not just open. It was kicked violently off its iron latch. Charles Wainwright burst into the kitchen, his fine clothes coated in mud, his eyes wide and manic, a heavy Colt revolver gripped tightly in his trembling hand. He swept the room, expecting to find a sobbing, hysterical woman. Instead, he found a mountain. Abigail stood tall, the twin barrels of the shotgun leveled directly at Charles's chest. Her round face, once the subject of his cruel mockery, was carved from absolute, unyielding stone. "Take one more step into my home, Mr. Wainwright," Abigail said, her voice deadly calm, "and I will paint the walls with you." Charles froze, the barrel of his revolver wavering. He looked at the massive weapon in her hands, then at the absolute lack of fear in her eyes. "You wouldn't," he sneered, though his voice cracked. "You're a baker's daughter, a fat, pathetic spinster from the city. You don't have the stomach for this." "You were right about one thing," Abigail replied coldly. "I'm a baker's daughter, which means I know exactly how to handle pests that try to ruin what is mine." "You don't understand what's beneath this floor," Charles screamed, stepping forward, his desperation overriding his fear. "Millions, a vein of solid gold. It was mine. Sarah was going to ruin it. She was going to tell the marshal about the tax lien. I had to stop her on the trail. I had to silence her, and now I will silence you." He raised his revolver, aiming directly at her face. But Charles Wainwright had fatally underestimated the sheer physical power of the woman standing before him. Abigail didn't fire the shotgun. She knew the spread at this distance could ricochet and penetrate the floorboards where the twins hid. Instead, with astonishing speed for a woman of her size, she lunged forward. Using her substantial weight and immense strength, she swung the heavy, solid walnut stock of the 10-gauge shotgun like a baseball bat. The heavy wood connected with Charles's wrist with a sickening crack. Charles shrieked in agony as the bones in his forearm shattered. The Colt revolver flew from his grasp, clattering uselessly into the stone hearth. Before Charles could even stagger backward, Abigail stepped into his space. She grabbed the lapels of his ruined broadcloth coat with her thick, powerful hands. Lifting him onto his toes, she drove him backward with the force of a runaway locomotive, slamming him brutally against the heavy log wall of the cabin. The impact knocked the remaining breath from his lungs. "You called me a burden," Abigail hissed, her face inches from his terrified eyes. "You called me a spectacle, but you will find, Charles, that I am the heavy hand of God upon you." The front door burst open. Adrian rushed in, his Winchester raised, his chest heaving. He saw Charles pinned against the wall, utterly neutralized by the woman he had once discarded. Adrian dropped his rifle. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, grabbing Charles by the throat and ripping him from Abigail's grasp. He threw the merchant onto the floorboards, drawing the heavy hunting knife from his belt. "You killed her!" Adrian roared, his ice-blue eyes blazing with a decade of grief and untamed fury. "You murdered the mother of my children." He raised the knife, ready to drive it through Wainwright's heart. "Jedediah, stop!" Abigail's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. She dropped the shotgun and placed her large, warm hands over Jedediah's trembling, knife-wielding fist. Adrian looked up at her, tears of pure rage streaming into his beard. "He buried her in the mud, Abigail. He deserves to be butchered like an animal." "He does," Abigail agreed softly, her thumbs stroking the scarred knuckles of her husband's hand. "But if you kill him now, in cold blood, you hang." The law will not care about his crimes if you become a murderer. You will leave Toby and Clara orphans. I will not allow you to destroy our family for the blood of a coward." Jedediah's chest heaved. He looked at the pathetic, sobbing man bleeding on their floorboards, then up at the fierce, beautiful, powerful woman holding him back from the abyss. Slowly, his hand relaxed. The knife dropped to the floor with a clatter. Adrian reached into his pocket and pulled out the muddy silver locket. He tossed it onto Charles's chest. "We found her. We found the note. The federal marshal in Durango will see you hang legally, Wainwright." Charles stared at the locket, all the fight draining out of him as the terrifying reality of the gallows set in. 3 days later, Deputy Miller, who had quickly turned state's evidence to save his own skin, escorted a heavily shackled Charles Wainwright down the mountain, flanked by 4 armed federal marshals. The discovery of Sarah's body and the blood-stained note proved to be the downfall of Silverton's most corrupt merchant. When the truth of the Sunnyside vein was brought before the federal judge, the forged tax lien was immediately voided. The massive gold deposit running beneath Black Bear Pass belonged entirely to Adrian Boone and his legal wife, Abigail. Within a year, the mountain had transformed. They did not move to a mansion in Denver, nor did they try to integrate into the cruel society of Silverton. Instead, Adrian hired a crew of honest carpenters to build a grand, beautiful ranch house right on the very plateau where the old cabin used to stand. It had wide glass windows, a massive stone fireplace, and enough bedrooms for a growing family. Abigail became a figure of immense respect in the territory. She used the mining royalties to fund an orphanage in Durango and built a proper schoolhouse for the children of the mining camps. When she walked down the streets of Silverton, dressed in the finest imported silk that perfectly complemented her robust, majestic figure, no one dared whisper a word of mockery. Men tipped their hats and women sought her advice. But her true joy remained on the mountain. On a crisp autumn afternoon, exactly 2 years after she had arrived at the train depot, a heartbroken, rejected woman, Abigail stood on the wide porch of her home. She watched as Adrian caused Toby and Clara across the grass, their wild laughter echoing off the granite peaks. She placed her hands gently over the swelling curve of her stomach, feeling the strong, steady kick of the new life growing inside her. Adrian jogged up the porch steps, breathless and smiling. He wrapped his massive arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You look like you own the whole world," he murmured, kissing her cheek. Abigail leaned back into his solid chest, looking out over the breathtaking valley she had fought so hard to protect. "I do not need the world, Jedediah," Abigail smiled, her heart utterly full. "I already have the mountain." Wow, what a thrilling and satisfying conclusion to Abigail and Jedediah's story. From a heartbroken woman, discarded at a train station, to a fierce, unstoppable protector who outsmarted and outmuscled a corrupt killer, Abigail proved that true strength and beauty come in all shapes and sizes. Her courage not only saved her new family, but brought a murderer to justice and secured their wealthy future on their own terms. If you loved watching Abigail turn her biggest supposed flaw into her greatest power, please hit that like button and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another dramatic, real-life inspired story. Let us know in the comments. What was your favorite moment of Abigail fighting back? See you next time.